All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. This is a city council work session called this evening to get information in regards to UDO amendments and an update on the UDO. One of the things that council had asked for and we had talked about doing is from time to time looking at the UDO ordinances and amendments and refining this as we go along. We realized that there was going to be potential changes that would come out as we used this and grew more and more familiar with it. And so tonight we have the opportunity for the first chance to review with staff some of the changes that they have seen and or would like to see, and maybe some items of note as we go through it. And so with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Merriman or Ms. Cotty, one of the other. Mr. Cotty's at the podium, so I think she's ready to go. So
Everyone's fine. Thank you, Mayor and Council, and thanks for your time this afternoon. You had a pretty lengthy agenda, so we thought a work session might be a little easier to ask questions going through this first package. The mayor really summed it up well. You know, as we went through the UDO adoption, we kind of said over and over, we fully expect to be bringing you guys quarterly or biannual at least updates as we implement the new code. So I do want to start just clarifying there were several, I think 3 to 4 amendments that council members brought up during second reading of the UDO. We are still doing some research on several of those topics, including building heights and underground utilities, and then still waiting for court case to resolve for fencing. So those have not been forgotten. They are still very much being researched and worked on and will be brought forward in another amendment package this year, but they're not part of this first cycle. So the first page of Exhibit B, which is again for first reading, this will be tonight. So Exhibit B was a table of the various changes. So this was just the Excel worksheet that you guys got on your dais tonight, as well as a copy of the presentation that I'm going to go through. The first page is a series of comments from Upstate Forever. I believe I mentioned to you guys at that second reading that we had received 2 or 3 pages of comments from Upstate Forever, but we got them 2 days before the scheduled adoption. So we had let you guys know that we'd be sending them to the landscape architect team with Kimley Horn and that they would be part of this first round of amendments. So the first kind of 10 or so are in response to Upstate Forever's comments. And just the format we were planning to take tonight, we have slides for each comment. It has a UDO section for reference, and then it has kind of what their comment was, and then the action that we took. And then I have a screenshot of the marked up code that actually has the red line, or in this case, kind of blue line. You'll have a mix of both. It just depended which staff did the red line on the draft. So I think I will just kind of go through them. If you guys have any questions or concerns, we can kind of talk about them as we go. Just, of course, this is a work session, so it's really for you guys to make sure you feel comfortable. So feel free to stop me at any point. Okay. Any questions before we get started?
Council?
No?
Let's
Okay.
get started.
All right, great. So again, these first kind of 10 comments are from Upstate Forever. They are mostly having to do with tree preservation and open space. So the first one was they asked us to redefine what heritage trees are to align with nearby municipalities. We did update language to be more consistent with jurisdictions nearby and add some language there.
What is a heritage tree?
So it is like a tree that's been on the site, and it's defined as a certain diameter width that can't be cut down. And then if it is cut down, then there's specific standards in place that then have you replace it at a higher level.
That's kind of like that tree that people used to kill the hogs, hang hogs on, right? Riley, down there at the sewer in 29, remember when we were doing all?
That big oak tree, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that would have been against the rules.
Yeah, and I don't have a problem with going from the 60 inches to 30 inches. I mean, a tree of 60 inches is going to be substantial. A 30-inch caliper tree is going to be, or diameter, either one, is going to be a pretty substantial tree. We do have a remediation in regards to a tree that may need to be removed or have to be removed for a site.
I do believe we do
All right.
in the next kind of section.
So,
Did we not already cover that originally in, isn't a development required to do a tree survey?
They are.
And then, so if they're gonna have to take out so many native species or whatever, then they're required to put trees back.
Yes, so they have a set tree save area that they have to, and if it is, if there isn't a tree save area, like if the site's already cleared, then they have to replant at a certain tree per acreage. The heritage tree is an additional protection for some of the really large trees.
Do we list heritage? Do we define it?
Yeah, so it's on the screen right now. So it's trees that are more than 30 inches or greater at diameter breast height, and they're native species and in good health.
So pine tree?
Could be.
I believe that's on the list, but I'd have to check our native species list.
so if I have a tree that's over 30 inches and I need to cut it down, I have to come to City Hall and get a permit to do that?
No, this is for projects.
Oh,
Like
this is
when you're
just for new
clearing a
development.
site,
New
yeah.
development.
Okay.
Yeah, this wouldn't be for like a single-family home,
Okay.
no. This would apply for like a new commercial site or a new residential housing development. When they do their tree survey, they would identify those trees.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And they identify them and then what?
Well, so if they're over the 30, which again is a pretty large tree, then they would need to preserve it and not remove it.
30 inch, not a large tree.
But they won't, let's say that they'll say it's a lot and it's filled with these trees. Are you saying they can't develop the lot?
Till they get a variance on some trees they might want to remove.
That's a good question. I'm gonna have to look into the rest of the section.
When you start, listen, I'll just say, when you start going down the road about, well, you can't cut this tree, or if you do, then you get, I mean, what do you have to come back with what's the size, you're just reading it, you had to come back with?
30. Oh, no, it can't be cut if it's over 30 inch. Well, it can be replaced. There's a formula for how many trees.
Yeah, there's a
it-
formula for
how many
that,
trees it will
for
have
the
to
other
replace it.
ones.
So at breast height, 30 inches in diameter, so just short of a yardstick.
The big tree.
Big tree.
That's a significant tree.
We don't get many of them in the tree surveys that I've seen.
Yeah. This is one of these things, we already had it covered originally, now we're trying to reinvent the wheel. If the market takes care of it, if you've got a tree that is 75 inches in diameter and it does not impede the development of that property, the developer is not going to pay somebody to push that thing down because that's expensive to do. I mean, why don't, just, and here again, let's stop using preserve. We need to use the word conserve. Big difference. But when we start getting this nitpicky, it just is going to, it's just like years ago, you weren't here, but and it wasn't even anything that was in the city. It was the oak tree where people, when they killed a hog, they came and hung it to bleed it out and all of that, and people got upset. But it had to be done. I mean,
Well, and that's why I don't know if the county has these regulations now or not, but that's why you used to have developers go ahead and clear cut the property and then ask for annexation.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a problem with saying do a tree survey and, maintain native habitat, all of that kind of stuff, but I don't know, just,
Remember this one, this is requested by Upstate Forever, so this wasn't a staff-generated.
no, I got it. I mean,
No, I will
got the
say.
whole list right here.
Yeah, so they asked for probably 20. We went ahead and updated about 8 to 10. And again, we consulted Kim Horn's landscape architecture team, and they did some research, and they recommended which ones to move forward with and which ones not to. Staff doesn't feel
So the only
extremely
thing-
strongly, so.
The only thing that we're changing on this particular piece of it is not the replacements, not anything else, it's just going from 60 inches to 30 inches.
Yes, that is correct.
That's the only thing that we're changing.
Correct.
So we've got some big pine trees down at Kids Planet, I mean, really big ones. And so that's why I was asking that we have to, so if we decide to do anything down there and we push those over, we've got to plant something else.
Yes.
Did you say there was a recourse if they need? to
I'm
remove a
gonna
tree?
have to, I don't know if you guys could take a look while we move on to the next ones.
There's a formula that says how many trees and the caliper of those trees have to equal or exceed
Yeah.
the ones that's taken down in some regards, what it is, yeah. If it's what I'm thinking about. All right, let's go to the next amendment here.
Okay, their next comment was to consider a plant exclusion list that prohibits all species that are invasive or non-native. Our code actually already did have a prohibited plant species list, but we did an additional sweep with some of the ones that they recommended were prohibited, and did add a couple to that list. So princess tree and nandina at the bottom.
Is the mulberry tree considered an invasive?
It is,
It is?
yes, it is on the list.
No, I see it's on the list, but it's considered invasive because there's certain birds that migrate through that's what they love to eat.
So this is a prohibited plant species, so there could be a number of reasons that they're prohibited.
But is it invasive or not?
I am not certain. So we just added, so we added language that said all invasive species, including but not limited to the species below, shall be prohibited. So it is a prohibited plant species, but it may not necessarily be invasive.
It said it could be, I mean, it says it could be under the nuisance category too, and it's, I know they drop a lot of berries and they make a big mess, especially if your car's close by, and we've got a big one that's right down below our house that hangs over the road, and it makes,
Oh, yeah.
it makes a big mess, but I do agree with you, I mean, the birds do
I mean,
like it.
it's the cedar waxwing that comes through that actually loves, I mean, they'll devour the whole thing in one, when they migrate through. I just,
I think they're just saying not to plant it. I mean, these things volunteer all over the place because of the bird droppings and
well, I
everything.
got it, but what I'm saying is that, well, what if we have a development and they want to do something for wildlife? That's a big deal. We always hear people say, well, all we're doing is we're taking away habitat for wildlife. And if you take away a food source, then they're just going to keep on going. I mean,
In that scenario, would they ask for some type of variance for like a specific
They certainly could.
wildlife initiative, or, I mean,
and you'd have to go before the BZA.
Yes, sir.
And pay more money.
I mean, it's a $300 fee in 1 month. It's a pretty easy process.
But it's a $300 fee.
Well,
I'm not,
here's the thing, or part of it. We're being asked to consider these things. Here's the other thing, and I have a little bit of a little bit of heartburn about this anyway is that a lot of what we've got in terms of regulation in here is probably beyond the expertise of our staff. In the winter, could you go out and identify a mulberry tree? I doubt you could, you know? I don't know that any of us could. You know, a lot of the cities that have adopted these things and Upstate Forever has encouraged them to do that, have full-time arborists and plant experts on staff. I know the city of Greenville, they've got 3 arborists on their planning staff. You know, they've probably got also one of the strictest tree regulations in the U.S., but nevertheless, you know, they've got the expertise to back it up. In our case, is our staff going to be out looking for somebody that's cutting down mulberry trees, or are we even going to know if they cut down mulberry trees? I think there's some of this that we're just going to have to take at some face value, and if it becomes an issue, you know, then we'll deal with it. You know, same thing with Japanese honeysuckle. Well, maybe somebody likes to suck on honeysuckle. So I mean, you know, there's a lot of these things that you could say. You know, Lespedeza, you might want to plant that as a crop control.
Yeah, it's actually good for the,
you know.
well, Lespedeza, that's part of what the highway department uses.
That's about 75% of what the highway department uses on banks, yeah. So, I mean, we've got to take a little bit of this on with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and just so you guys know, typically where staff is reviewing is we get landscape plans that are part of the site development plan, where they have tables and list how many and what species they are. So that's where we would be looking to see if they have these species that aren't allowed. And then typically when we go out in the field, we're counting to make sure they have as many as are on the plan, and they're usually tagged with a species of tree. We haven't really had a lot of problems, but if we did have concerns, we do have an arborist on the Parks and Rec staff that we could consult that has offered his services, but it hasn't been a huge problem thus far. Sorry, there's people trying to get in your door.
All right.
Okay, so the next one, they said if a recommended plant species list is used, ensure the list is comprehensive by relying on recommendations. Ensure that all species are native and or non-invasive. And so again, the team did do another sweep and recommend a few changes in these tables. So they removed the golden rain tree, Unimus, and Tamarix juniper. The next is encourage natural features that mitigate stormwater runoff by allowing bioswales, rain gardens, and other forms of low-impact development to count towards open space. So we did add additional allowance of passive open space if you're utilizing some low-impact development.
Okay, so we're not going to allow stormwater ponds to be open space.
A portion of them can count towards it.
But if you plant species of plants that retard the flow of water, that's what you're saying?
We're saying that different features that are considered low-impact development,
So,
like bioswales and alternatives to ponds.
okay, a bioswale, tell me what that is.
Honestly, I'm not 100% sure. That would be something our stormwater engineer would be reviewing on the plans.
Well, let me give you an example. The first thing that pops into my mind, there's a native grass called big blue stem. It's a real tall grass, and it is used for erosion and all this. It is native. If you go out and you can find the seed in our seed bank out in the woods. So if you plant that, if that is, you plant it and it takes the place of part of the storm.
A general retention pond.
So what's the purpose in the pond versus these other species? I mean, what's the difference in saying, because you just said that could count as open space.
It's just to incentivize low-impact development, different methods than just a traditional stormwater pond.
I'm sorry, I don't know what that means, low impact. If you plant something that it generally is like that, it's like people can't use it. It's still gonna be, the density is not gonna, you're not gonna be able to use it.
Right, and it would just count more towards your passive open space requirement than a traditional pond would.
So the Cultural Arts Center,
No, I understand that. I'm just trying to understand, you can't, if you have a pond that's taking up 1,000 square feet, they don't want to allow that for open space. Then you come in and you say, okay, we're going to do 1,000 square feet of whatever fits that bill. Now, I understand the point of it looking better, but it's still unusable land. So I thought the point of open space was where people could get out and walk and enjoy and do things like that.
Typically, the bioswales, I understand it, they're accessible, they won't be fenced off. It's another option for low impact or passive open space that is accessible. It's not like active open space where you have a field or something along those lines where kids can play, but it is a place where, butterflies and basically turning a stormwater control area into something that's, one, more aesthetically pleasing, two, more akin to the natural environment, assuming there was more water flow in that area, and three, provide an opportunity in theory for passive open space. That's how those bioswales typically work.
so if you had a requirement for Cultural Arts Center, that you needed 1,000 square feet of retention pond. Under this, you'd get a 10% allowance for using low impact. You'd need 900 feet of low impact, which they've done with those random little areas, landscaped areas all over the back up there. That's my take on this is.
Yeah, it's just it's only an additional 10% allowance towards counting towards the passive open space. It's just a small incentive to use these LID principles. They're not common. So their next one is specify standards for tree maintenance to align with best practices, and they had specific industry standards that they wanted us to reference. We did add those. Again, I know that our staff is not, we're not certified arborists, but we do have landscape architects contact us constantly asking for standards, and they are very, they're very interested in following the rules. They just want the rules. And so our previous code didn't have a lot of standards for landscaping, tree preservation, open space, species. So it is a guidance for those professionals who prepare those plans. The next one is specify standards readers should reference when selecting plant materials. So we did again add a reference to the American Standard for nursery stock as they asked. And then, again, another reference, clarify tree installation should conform to ANSI A300 standards. Again, we are not going to be able to enforce this very well, but it's hopefully a guidance for those who are doing the installation. And then include winter within the recommended planting seasons, October through March. So we did add that. Again, it's just a recommendation. We typically do allow for bonding of landscaping if it's during the middle of summer or something where something wouldn't survive. And then they asked to add more specific criteria to ensure species diversity. So the Kimley Horn team did add a table with different standards to ensure more species diversity for what was required, so that we don't have just, 100% pine or something. We have different species of trees to mix it up. And then they also wanted standards to design minimums for adequate soil volume, so they gave us a reference to use for guide. So this is kind of the planting area between trees. And again, this is something we can, read on the plans with the spacing between the trees. So we did add that as another guidance for those landscape architects. Okay, so those are all of the Upstate Forever. Again, there was a series.
What is it says redefine significant trees to include protection for understory trees. I know what an understory tree is. Why are we trying to protect what's coming up underneath the big trees?
That was their recommendation. Staff and the Kimley Horn team did not want to take that recommendation. We didn't want to get into regulating.
So that's been scratched, right?
Correct. So the first 8 or so on this table, oh dear, what did I do? Sorry. Okay, sorry about that.
I go back 1 second to another recommendation from Upstate Forever. The planting season. I see where it is a recommended planting season, and it does say, if schedule or weather does not allow for the installation of the plant material within these windows, a temporary certificate of occupancy may be granted per this section. It doesn't say that the landscaping can't be done outside of that window. Is there some inference that it can't be, or that it just shouldn't be? I mean, that's a pretty narrow window for planting. I mean, here we are in April. I wouldn't hesitate to be planting something right now. And in fact, some of the creeping grasses and stuff aren't even barely available at this point. So, I don't think if you're a professional landscaper that there's a time of the year that they don't work.
I mean, I would agree with that. It does not prohibit you from planting outside of that. It is just a recommendation. We do have standards in place that if they plant something and it dies, they're going to have to replace it. So it would behoove them to.
Well, then, so why
It would depend on what you were planning as to what season you would pick.
even put it there? That's why I was leading you.
Sure.
We do require, if you plant it and it dies, you got to replace it. We require, if you plant it, you have to maintain it the way it's supposed to be maintained. Because we've had some businesses that just let their trees go, and we sent folks out there and had it taken care of.
I'll be honest, staff doesn't feel strongly about it. It was a recommendation, so it didn't seem harmful to add the language, but don't have strong feelings about keeping it.
Yeah, and I just don't like the piece about the temporary certificate of occupancy. I don't like that lingers until it's.
Oh, that is very standard practice for what we do right now, actually. So if we have required landscaping, like at let's say the new Starbucks that's really close to getting their CO, if the only thing that they don't have is their landscape and they've seeded, then we will give them a temporary CO to open, and they have to have it within 3 or 6 months or whatever is required.
So they are intentionally delaying the installation of those plant materials based on.
No, not intentionally, just, I mean, if it's the middle of the summer, or the middle of the winter where they feel like it's gonna die and not be worth their money, we don't wanna hold them up from opening just for landscaping.
Okay, I understand.
So that is common practice right now, but again, happy to reconsider that. It, again, doesn't happen that often, but it
I
does.
understand that scenario makes sense. I get it. Okay. I just didn't know if there was a situation where a CO would have to be, instead of a temporary, a permanent CO would have to be granted for financing or something like that that could hold up a project, or, could keep somebody from moving into a place or something like that.
We haven't had that problem arise so far, but we certainly could work with someone if they did need a full CO.
Now, what
to
could
make them
happen-
aware of our regulations that we would issue a violation if they didn't have it within a certain amount of time.
You know, what could happen is if you don't have if you have a temporary CO and you don't comply with what you're supposed to do, I guess the building department could remove that certificate of occupancy, temporary, and then the owners, whoever's there, the tenants, owners, couldn't occupy it. I guess that's the big stick is they have to make it get done.
You said you could bond it?
Sometimes they do
We would
bond.
prefer to bond. Landscaping's very difficult to enforce. It's not a building code requirement. It's a building code requirement. We use that as a tool, but if we get into a situation where they can't plant fall, we would prefer to get a bond. And
That way we can go back,
we're not gonna go vacate the building because they didn't plant landscape.
that way we can go back and do the work, is what you're saying? Okay.
Or move it, yeah, move all the equipment in. So a lot of times they get a TCO to move equipment in, and not the public.
And I'm not going to belabor the point, but to Ruthie's point, it's going to be a whole lot simpler for them to plan it and replace the dead than it is to go get a bond, because 99% of landscapers aren't going to be able to go get a bond. And it's going to be 110, 115% of the total project to get the bond. They're not going to do that and pay that kind of money when they can do the replacements for 10% of what they're going to spend on a bond. Okay, we'll move on.
Landscaping knowledge.
So those are all of the recommendations from Upstate Forever. Again, there are more on the table that they recommended, but staff and the team did not propose updates for several of those.
Does Upstate Forever, do they also make recommendations like for Greenville City, Greenville County, and
They
other
do.
Malden and all the other?
Yeah, they're typically very involved. They were a stakeholder on our Unified Development Ordinance Stakeholder Committee, and they are typically very involved when any of the jurisdictions in the upstate do comprehensive plans, Unified Development Ordinance, or zoning changes. They were very, very involved with Greenville's. That got adopted about 6 months before ours. And in fact, they did bring forward a lot of suggestions from their code, both on landscaping and affordable housing, that, you know, some were considered and some were a little too much for Greer compared to Greenville. So, yes, they are a great partner. They're very involved. We appreciate their diligence. Okay, so these are, the next kind of 10 are staff-initiated updates. Again, these are just based on people calling and asking questions, new developments coming in that we have tried to apply the code and just find things that we think could be better. So the first one is regarding the site development plan review process. Those are our civil plans and stormwater plans. Right now, we do not have an expiration, so we do have a couple of plans that were submitted back in 2021 that are still kind of in our queue that haven't been approved and haven't been withdrawn, that we haven't gotten updates on. You know, a lot can change in 3 years in terms of codes, in terms of land use around it. So we would like to have a 6-month expiration, and they can be granted an extension up to another 6 months. And then after that, they would just be considered withdrawn and need to reapply. It is a lot of staff time to do a first review, and then when you go a year between submittals, it tends to be a first review again. So it is a real drain on staff resources. Any questions? Okay.
So how long does it normally, when a set of civil drawings are submitted? And let's say this is a project that's going to go ahead, how long does it take you to give the stamp of approval?
It's very variable. I'd say it can be as quick as 2 to 3 months. It can take up to a year depending on the responsiveness of the engineer. So when they first submit a set of plans, most departments respond within 2 weeks. Stormwater has, per ordinance, up to 30 days. They typically give responses within 2 to 3 weeks max. And then again, it depends on the engineer taking those comments and then giving us a resubmittal. So they may resubmit within 2 weeks, they may resubmit 6 months later. So it just really, really depends.
Okay, so when does the 6 months time clock begin?
So if we were to give comments back and they took more than 6 months to submit a new set of plans.
Okay, do we have that defined as in, okay, you have 6 months to incorporate what we've talked about into your plans? Is that in black and white?
No, currently it just says inactivity, so if you'd like us to define that further, we certainly could.
It does provide for a little bit of grace in giving the director the ability to grant the extension as well. So to your point, I think if there is some dialogue back and forth and clarifying questions.
Okay,
so
and
I imagine
the
that would-
5th month, 29th day, you get a letter from the engineer saying, yeah, we're working on it. Does that count?
That
Does.
is the same way we do building permits, same language. They have 6 months to start work. If they need an extension, they request it and we grant it.
Okay, but, so if they call in and that, so the example I just gave you, that complies with getting another 6 months, is that right?
If we know they're actively working on it, we would not close it out.
Okay, the next section is code enforcement, and this was just a section that was inadvertently left out of the UDO. It does look like a lot of text, but all of it is from our previous zoning ordinance, that it was just inadvertently left out, except for the addition of a definition for commercial vehicle. That is a very common code enforcement issue, commercial vehicles in residential districts. So we have proposed to add a definition of a commercial vehicle, and we did consult our code enforcement officer and do additional research on defining that. That would give him some teeth to be able to enforce.
What kind, I'm sorry, tell me how the commercial vehicle, where does it belong in the code enforcement?
In our code, we do not allow commercial vehicles to be parked in residential districts, so like in a neighborhood. So if you have a pickup truck or something that you run a landscape business, that's not an issue. But a commercial vehicle would be a certain length and a certain poundage, like trailers. We've had semis that are detached. We've had large construction equipment that have been brought to neighborhoods. It's one of our top 10 kind of complaints that we get calls about.
But you said if you run a landscape business and they've got a vehicle out there and it's any vehicle that's able to carry so much weight has got a commercial tag on it.
So there are very specific criteria that are set out with length and pounds. It wouldn't necessarily be the commercial tag. So like an F-150 or something is not going to trigger this. But if it had a really long,
250 or 350, because those are used, those have to be tagged with a commercial tag generally.
right, if they meet the criteria that's in that definition, yes, but I doubt it.
Yeah, I think that's where we start getting into a gray area, because I had a complaint from a gentleman that his neighbor parks two F-350 dualies in front of his house next door, and this guy was complaining about it, and there's no signage or anything on the trucks, but I would have to assume they're probably used for business purposes, but, you know, we specifically say, I think, family vans not transporting passengers for a fee, standard manufactured pickup trucks and dual rear wheel pickup trucks used for personal use are expressly excluded from the definition. So apparently you can park your dually in front of the house.
Okay, the next is the table of permitted uses. We did update the locations that vehicle sales and rental would be allowed, primarily in our commercial corridor, which is our old C3. C2 or commercial general or other districts are not as compatible with this auto-oriented use, so that's an update. We made a number of changes to the signs. One of them is just moving a reference for separation so that it's easier to find for the sign folks who are reading our code. We did update allowances for changeable copy or EMC signs. They were only allowed on a monument sign. Now they're allowed anywhere, on any type of sign in the districts that they're allowed in. We added setback references, a minimum of 5 feet from property lines, which is our standard, or was our standard in the zoning ordinance. Made the wall sign locations a little more liberal. It was confined to just above the entrance before, so we are not wanting to be that nitpicky. And then we removed landscaping requirements for monument signs, feel that the buffers and open space and perimeter plantings are plenty to cover landscaping, that we don't need to throw in additional standards with signs. For buffers, we did reduce buffers between regional center and commercial corridor and medium and high density from a 3 to a 2. Again, these are both really high intensity uses, so didn't think it needed as intense of a buffer. The next is screening for in-ground dumpsters, just adding a requirement that the director can waive screening in situations that make compliance impracticable. A good example is some of the areas downtown where we'd really like to encourage the in-ground dumpsters, but screening like landscaping or walls just may not fit. But it's still going to be preferable to a dumpster enclosure. The next is open space and amenities. We updated the open space table for non-residential development. And we were finding when we did like a self-storage building, having a percentage of space that needed to be designated for open space or active open space just didn't seem to make a lot of sense. And again, with our buffers and our perimeter plantings and other requirements, we felt that we had plenty of other ways to enforce that. The next are changes to cluster development. We did do a lot of changes. We had 3 different residential developments come in and taking a look at it. This was one we were honestly the least sure about, that we really wanted to kind of see how it worked. And so we were able to discuss with a couple different engineers and developers and propose some changes. So we did remove the lot placement in the table. So that means the estate lots wouldn't necessarily have to be around the perimeter. They could be wherever within the development. We reduced the side setbacks. Our previous cluster development allowed 5-foot side setbacks, and it seemed like a reasonable request. We reduced the allowance for buffers to count towards open space. Again, if they're going to be doing cluster development, the whole point is to give something in return. And then we did insert a minimum of a type 2 buffer into the standards, and then reduce the required housing types from 3 to 2. So those are the changes for cluster. The next slide is a public comment we received from an engineer that's working on a project and does a lot of work in the upstate. He did support several of the changes we proposed, and then we had originally proposed to eliminate using sorry, we originally were gonna go to 100% to where you couldn't count any toward your required 30% buffer, but it was 50. We were gonna go to 100, so you couldn't count it at all. And then after researching best practices from other jurisdictions, we did decide to go to 30%. So that is, again, allowing the part of the perimeter buffer to be counted towards the 30% common open space. Okay, and then the last was just updating the definition of structure. It was a very basic definition, and we've had a couple of permits come in. We felt that the definition from our old zoning ordinance was much more specific and helpful for making determinations for what counted towards setbacks. So the last is a definition update to structure. And that is all of the proposed changes. Again, this will be brought forward tonight during first reading. Happy to answer any questions, or you guys have about 10 minutes before your meeting. So whatever the will of council is.
So when do we use the definition of structure? Under what circumstance?
Typically, it's whether or not to apply the side or rear setbacks for building permits.
So swimming pools won't fall under that, or?
They typically do not. However, like if there were an enclosed utility structure, like a pool house or cabana, those would.
Council, questions? Comments? Any further discussion at this point in time? You'll see that this item is on the agenda. As first reading, ordinance to amend the City of Greer Unified Development Code Ordinance, the UDO, and adopt a package of amendments. So it comes to us later for further discussion if you like. Anything at this point in time before I conclude the workshop? Hearing nothing, then we're going to conclude our workshop this evening.